Well, good morning. So this morning, no script. I just put up a post, and I thought I would just share it. I can't believe I haven't really talked about it here on the podcast. So I went to 0 Dark 30 on social media for the last 2 years, a little more than 2 years. It's about 2.5 years now. I initially planned it to be 1 year, right? Do something for a year. So what I was trying to do was make myself a good reader. Up until a few years ago, longer than a few years, it was about 5 to 8 years ago, I had to start reading studies online to try to solve my disease because it was just destroying my life. And I did that for a few years, and I realized my writing was getting better. I've told the story that when I first started reading and writing as an adult in his 40s, I started using the Hemingway editor. It's this app available online, and it tells you how good your writing is, and it gives you some tips on how to fix it. When I first started writing a few years ago, my writing was on average a grade 17. And I thought I was doing awesome because I thought that meant that I wrote like someone who had the education. No, what that means is my writing was so difficult, so laborious to read, that you'd have to have a grade 17 education to understand what I was saying too. Like, kind of, my writing was like E.E. Cummings on mushrooms, right? No punctuation, my own version of grammar. It was a wild, wild west. But up till today, I haven't been using the Hemingway editor for a few years now because, well, I just write, and actually for the last 2 or 3 years, I've been using AI, which is what Hemingway editor and Grammarly are. They're AI, right? I've been using AI for a long time because of my philology work, my translation work. But so my point here today is I ran into a situation where, well, I'll be honest, I had to begin reading books. Right? I couldn't just listen to studies or read studies online. I was lucky because I got to the point where I learned how to read and use PubMed, so I could just skim, jump to the important parts of the document. I wasn't reading the whole thing through, but I got to a point where I had to start reading. Right? Books like Basil van der Kolk's The Body Knows the Score. What I actually started was physical books by Cabermate. I don't recommend any of his later stuff because he's just fallen off the deep end. Again, audience capture. So he is not great. But, so here's my takeaway. I just put up a post this morning and I realized that I've succeeded in doing something that most people think was impossible. Yes, I've actually put my horrible disease into remission, but what I'm talking about is reading. I taught myself how to read and how to write as an adult, and also as an adult who was functionally illiterate. I mean, I was a banker, but once the bank went digital and everything had to be done digitally, that was pretty much the death knell for me. And I left, and I got an AZ, which is a CDL. I could drive just about anything on the road. You can even drive heavy equipment. But the reason why I did that is they told me I'd be able to keep a digital log. I'd be able to keep a voice log. No, that was taken away. Now, not only do you have to keep a physical log, a lot of companies have gone to like a little computer, like my absolute nightmare. So, of course, this made my disease so much worse, right? Leaving the bank and then auto finance because, well, I can just tell you, they're all crooks. They really are. I mean, you might find an honest one here and there, but that's his shtick, right? He's using the honesty as his shtick. Because I can tell you, as one of the only honest finance ministers in the industry, and I was, because I was known almost nationally, because I did well. Why? Because I didn't push anything on anyone. I sold it based on utility, on benefit. And so unlike the other sales managers, finance managers, and the salesmen, by the way, who loved me, because the customers would come back, and the salesmen get paid for that back office stuff, right? The finance and insurance. Well, the customers would come back telling the salesman before they even saw me, they wanted to see me specifically because I didn't push them on stuff and sold them based on benefit. But they actually wanted to see me because they wanted to buy the same thing again when they got another car. So my numbers were almost on par with the other F&I managers who were twisting numbers, lying, pulling stuff, scams, cajoling, lies. Never did that. But the problem is I couldn't tell people that because no one's going to believe you that you're honest. You just had to show them. Right? But even that became a problem because the paperwork got more and more and more and more computer work and more paperwork and more computer work, more tracking. So I was done. I mean, I just couldn't do anything more. My disease got so bad I couldn't even hardly survive. But worse yet, my doctor, really bad example. My disease, he let me suffer for 10 years. I actually just realized recently he might have actually finally got me a consult with the dermatologist because of a fear of malpractice, maybe. Because he let me suffer for 10 years, telling me there was nothing more, but all he did was give me pills. In the end, I went to the hospital because I had an abscess so bad in my hip that I couldn't even walk, sit, lie down. So I needed it drained. And because I was in such tremendous pain, not from the abscess, like they could poke it and prod it all they wanted. That was nothing compared to the pain I was in, my bones, my joints. I got a consult in the hospital here in Canada, which is unheard of. And a dermatologist figured out what was going on. Now, they didn't tell me. I mean, imagine me, dyslexic, stressful, in pain. I had no idea what they said. The doctor couldn't pronounce the name of the disease properly. And just as an insight, as a dyslexic, we have trouble hearing phonemes. I make a joke with the wife that I hear the weirdest things when people say something. And I think how I've survived is I have this fast code switching brain. And it's become a game to me. When someone says, oh, the cheese is right, what they really mean is, oh, it's, you know what I mean? They're actually saying something else. But to me, it sounded like the cheese is right. And eventually, I think with practice, the mind starts to decode and figures out what more likely they might have said. But what I never realized is the dyslexic brain is working so hard on a daily basis just to decode the world the way most people see it. We have infinite stores of mindfulness available. I think this is proven by that, but also an ability to see through these things. And what I mean by this is that, well, I was just doing my light therapy this morning as usual, and I was picking out a book to listen to. I listened to at least a book a day on average. And that's what I did. I stepped back and I said, listen, I need to learn to read. But reading a book takes me forever. So why don't I double down on this idea of audiobooks? I've been using audiobooks my entire life. Why don't I double down on this idea and where will it get me? Well, after about 2.5 years, I've read well over 1,000 books, a book a day. And where this came from is it was actually upset at the leading researcher on dyslexia and reading. Her name is Marianne Wolf. She's written a couple books. I recommend them both. Proust and the Squid, and then her other one, it's, I can't remember what it's called. It's about readers in the digital age. I can't remember the title, but Marianne Wolf, you'll find her, leading researcher on reading. The sad part is she says some really insightful things that we're born listeners, born storytellers, but we have to learn to read. But she doesn't realize, well, then why aren't we giving our children audiobooks, ebooks, and physical books? Letting them use it. Now, when I teach language, I realize this is what I was doing. I tell people to get, say, for example, Le Petit Prince, The Little Prince, written by a Frenchman by the name of Antoine des Exupéry. And his French was so advanced, so awesome, that it's a challenge to people today who speak French, let alone a challenge for children, but certainly readable. So I recommend someone trying to practice their French. This is what I did, actually. I practiced it because, again, I love the book, especially the Fox. Missed in translation, by the way. The idea is not taming. In French, the word is closer to becoming friends, of valuing, getting to know, right? Not taming. But that's neither here nor there. What I recommend is you listen to the French of the book and follow along in English, and then vice versa. And I found that made my French exponentially better. But most importantly, it's developing this thinking in the language. And this is what I've always said. This is why I was so upset when I found out that Marianne Wolf, the leading researcher on dyslexia and reading, she had a son. Lucky enough, 1 in 5 of us get tested. He got tested. Right? I was so severely dyslexic, I didn't get tested till grade 10. Well, actually my second time through grade 10, I had a teacher who had a learning disability and recognized it. They ignored how severe my dyslexia was. And I think it's because my grade 9 aptitude test, that test they give you when you come in, I just picked, randomly bubbles to fill in. And I ended up testing about average. So that's how I think they thought I was just, not smart, rather than having a severe learning disability, right? I couldn't read, I couldn't write, I couldn't decode, I could speak, I had a great memory, right? And at that point, I was speaking English and French, so, right, they said that actually made things worse, but I gotta tell you, that fast code switching and recognizing the different phonemes, I think the bilingualism saved my life. Right? My memory, of course, but also the bilingualism. But what shocked me is Marianne Wolf. Did she teach her kid to read? Did she teach him to become a full human being? No. He was good in art, so she pushed him into art, into graphic art. He'll never be a full human being. That's what I realized. As Helen Keller said, it wasn't until she was given language that more so I used to, before I was able to read the little bit that I had heard, I misunderstood this idea that Helen Keller, just her world expanded when she was taught about reading and language. But more, her actual quote, what she actually said was, language gave her herself, her identity, her being. She understood about I, herself. And this is the heart of Martin Buber's I and Thou, right? He wrote an entire book talking about the problem with society and the world is we see ourselves as an I and we treat others in the world as an it, I and Thou. And you want to talk about religion, right? I've studied a lot about this. If you look at the Old Testament or the Hebrew Torah, the heart of it is love, right? To love God with all of your strength and to love your neighbor as you love yourself. That's from Deuteronomy and Leviticus. And Jesus, in the New Testament, combined them into one. He was asked by a scribe, what is the ultimate commandment? And he's like, well, to love God with all your body, mind, and strength, and to love your neighbor as you love yourself. So he combined those two. Very awesome. And Augustine, St. Augustine of Hippo, what most people would attribute to modern Christianity and how his thinking built their theology essentially. And he argued we didn't have to be taught how to love ourselves. That was just a given. Fast forward to today, or even before that, fast forward to about, say, 100 years ago, Jung said the biggest shock for him was the wholeness view of the Eastern mind versus our, self-concentric view. Well, I go one step further, and having taught Buddhism, having given tours in not just a Buddhist museum, but also a temple, and actually having given guidance to not just other Buddhists, but Buddhist educators and translators from around the world, my one takeaway is simple. It's engagement. It's your passion for these sorts of things, right? And I've always said this, that we don't teach our kids algebra so that they can all be algebrists eventually. We teach them this stuff so that they can think, right? So I argue, they admit, and I've worked extensively through this, through the data and with AI, if only 20% of our population actually ends up getting tested as learning disabled or dyslexic, and our numbers show us that, well, that's at least only half. At least half of the students fall through the cracks. I argue it's even more than that, right? Because if I fell through the cracks as the most severe dyslexic that you could be, right? I had issues in every area for the most part, except for my verbal, but even then I have trouble, memory issues. If you listen to my stuff, you've heard. I forget simple words, I argue that we're looking at 60 to maybe even 80% of our population have some sort of a learning issue. And I argue we can solve that overnight by providing our students the physical books, the audiobooks, and the ebooks. I use all three, especially for, searching. The ebooks are fantastic. You can do a lot of adjustment, right? Reading the text, like I use ebooks when I don't have an audiobook. There's quite a few apps that will read text to audio. But long story short, I just can't believe that no one else has realized the secret weapon of audiobooks. Me as an accident. I guess it was a miracle, because before I even knew I was dyslexic, before I was even of the age of reading, I'm like most other people. I never read a book until I was probably, 14. I don't think my parents ever read to me. Right? I had a really bad upbringing. My parents were, doing their best, but they were just the worst in so many ways. But they were the type, especially my father, he was the worst. He wanted people to think he was awesome, right? He was a British trained millwright mechanic who wouldn't fix anything around the house or our vehicles, but would be over at the neighbors for 3 days straight if they needed front end alignment, right? So he was going to volunteer with the Canadian National Institute for the Blind, CNIB. And that's where I discovered audiobooks. Not just for the blind, but they were even providing it for people who had learning disabilities and seeing, right? It just blew my mind to find out about this. So I leveraged that. Right? For example, in the bank, most people didn't even know you can get most of your stuff through an audiobook. Most people didn't know you can get a lot of the textbooks as an audiobook. But see, I went through this before we had all these apps. This is what blows my mind. I didn't have an app that I could put my textbook into and it could read it out to me. Right? When I was going through school, well, of course, welcome to Canada, I didn't get enough money to pay for textbooks, so I would photocopy my buddies' textbooks, right? And what was awesome is I could blow it up. It made it easier for me to read. And I talked about this before when I got my mutual funds certification, very similar to, like I was also a certified stockbroker, right? Stock analyst. But that one, I took earlier, so I don't really, my professor told me I was one of the best students he'd ever had, but I know for a fact when it comes to the mutual funds, because I had to do that all by myself. This is why I use it as an example. I had to spend weeks reading through this textbook. It was a big textbook. 300 pages. I never read anything that big or that long. Very complicated. It took me weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks. And I had no confidence in my ability to remember, but I read and I read and I reread and got to understand these concepts. I lived with this material, kind of like what I've did for the last couple of years, right? I lived with that material. And, well, at the time I was going to college. I had a girlfriend, had 2 jobs, taking the bus in a northern Ontario town, so the buses weren't that great. So I had to take the bus to a satellite campus of the college where they were conducting this test, because it was actually taking 150% course load. I was taking my, business administration marketing? I can't remember exactly the title of the course. It was a 3-year course. And for the first year, I was taking 150% course load because I was taking a bunch of banking courses too from the Institute of Canadian Bankers, I think is what they called themselves back then. Yeah. And so I had to go to the satellite campus to write the test. Well, I had to take the bus. I was late. Everyone else were bankers, and, right? They drove there in their BMWs and stuff. I had to take the bus. Came in, right, with my backpack, and, I had to get all undressed because, again, I had to dress up for the weather because standing for the bus is not like sitting in your nice heated, leased European car. I joke about that because I was never into that. I was a weird banker who drove 4x4s, older trucks and stuff. I wasn't stupid enough to, you know how much money you waste buying, even if you're replacing it every 5 years, the amount of money you're wasting, drive your vehicle for 10 years, at least. I personally argue drive it for 20, but neither here nor there. So college kid writing one of the first, mutual fund, certification courses, huge textbook. These, bankers, I found out later, with so much trouble with it. I probably could make a fortune, just teaching some of these guys how to pass these courses and understand these simple things like return on equity and stuff. So I showed up late. I was the last one in, sat down, wrote the test, took my time, went through it a couple times to make sure everything was correct. And, because I told you about confidence. This is, I think, the secret, right? The greatest forecasters are those that have doubts, especially in their own ideas. But I ended up being finished first. And so that worried me a little bit, because that's why I stopped, and no one else was done. So I reviewed, and I'm like, yeah, I got this. I'm done. I can't do much better. So finally handed in and I left. First one out. So I was a little nervous because of that. And so I called for my marks. And I am not exaggerating when I say this. The young lady, or the lady on the other end of the phone, when she pulled up the number, she literally, I can't remember exactly what, it was she made noises, is how I could say it. And I thought it was bad. I'm like, what? And she's like, oh, she said, you did great. She said, it's the highest mark I've ever seen. I was like, what? She's like, yes, you did awesome. And, she was pretty chuffed. And, what's funny is my reading protocol, my learning protocol. Even back then, I didn't realize until the last couple of years that it worked so incredibly well, because I had to recertify for my mutual funds. Working in the bank for as long as I did, I had to recertify at least 2 or 3 times. I can't remember. I think it was every 5 years or 3 years. I can't remember. So I had to rewrite the test a number of times. It might have been every 5 years. And I had to write it at least 2 or 3 more times. And I never had to restudy. I just wrote the test and passed them each and every time. Right? Same as the Canadian securities course. I was the only person in the bank that actually understood all this stuff. In fact, I was recruited by the Scotia McLeod, but I didn't want to go because what initially brought me to the bank is I was recruited by one of these, what did they call them back then? Boiler room operations. It was this firm that was supposed to be doing stocks, right? I remember the TV show in Canada, it was called Traders. I wanted to be the guy that was the analyst. A crazy analyst down in his own little room there. But I didn't have the computer skills. But this place was just ripping off grannies. I did not like it, so I just turned my back on that whole industry completely. So I stayed with the bank until there was nowhere else to go. Left the bank and went into finance. Which eventually destroyed my health. And like I said, once everything became digitalized and computerized, and I was just left not being able to do anything. That's why I went to get my my heavy equipment operating, because I did that when I was young, and a Class AZ to be able to drive just about anything. But guess what? We have ruined this world in so many ways, but the thing we don't notice is, I argue a good half of our population is struggling just to get by because we have digitized everything. Right? I mean, even my own government, I've asked for things in paper because of my disability, and they laugh at me. Imagine that. Canada, one that's supposed to be, taking care of everyone, but literally, my experience with my government has been Kafkaesque. It has been monstrous how they've treated me. I mean, just one example, I was told to go to college because they would give me a laptop and all of this additional aid because I couldn't read or write, remember? They sent me to college, and not only did they not give me all of the financial help that I needed, so I had to get a job just to survive, which, imagine. They also encouraged me to do that 150% course load, which I did good in the first year. And I got a 3.5 GPA, believe it or not, without the laptop, without the tape recorder. They did give me a tape recorder, but it didn't have a power plug or the pack for the batteries, so it was absolutely worthless. And I had to spend some of my money to buy cassette tapes because they told me they were going to get me the battery pack adapter, and they never did. So I eventually bought myself the tape. Like I said, I bought the tapes, but I bought myself the power pack, right? Well, one of those universal plug-in. But at the college, again, this is plus years ago, the closest plug for the prof left me just hearing people shuffling their books and their bags and their feet, and I couldn't hear the lecture. Right? So by the time my second and third year came around and the finance kept dwindling, Kafkaesque. But what I've realized is, well, I don't know whose quote it was, but what they say is, the people most in need of help will be the last to speak up. The people that least need the help are the loudest. I got that. There's a quote by somebody really famous. They say, anyone who protests have never had to live through anything, because the more suffering you've had to endure, the quieter you become. Yeah. And I likened it to one of the books I read in the beginning of this journey, by Sebastian Junger. It's called Tribe. And just to prove to you that audiobooks are, I think, even better than physical books, I can still quote from hundreds, if not thousands, of books that I've read and listened. But again, science has just proved me right, because when you're listening, you're reading, and when you're reading physically, you're listening in your head. So it is the same thing. But Sebastian Junger was writing about Tribe. But what he did is he embedded himself with the soldiers. And one of the biggest takeaways for me, besides the fact that our soldiers are most traumatized by coming back to this world, and people just don't understand what other people go through. It's like these adult children. They don't understand what other people don't know. But you also don't understand what other people know. Right? We don't understand how much suffering there is in the world. We don't understand what our soldiers have to go through. I've talked about this endlessly, that we don't even understand what the family of our soldiers go through. I tried to explain this to our Veterans Administration here in Canada, that we need to train our vets and their family before they're traumatized. It's the only way to truly keep them safe and not have them damaged. But I digress. So as I said, Sebastian Junger said our society tends to traumatize them even worse than they combat. But here's the worst takeaway. Do you know who the loudest voices for PTSD treatment are in the military? It's the rear echelon guys. 70% of these people asking for help are people that never saw I might be a little off on that, but the people that really needed the help, the ones that were really traumatized, really in battle, they're the least, right? They'll be the last to speak up and ask for help. And this is what I think is the same thing here, right? I am even talking to a teacher that's working on a theory that we're traumatizing our children. So we're actually making them averse to education. And he never even thought about, well, what if 60-80% of our children have some sort of learning disability? So we're traumatizing regular kids just the way we teach in our education system. So imagine what we're doing to our kids that are learning disabled, right? You tell them to read something on the board and they can't read it. Right? I never understood why. I took 2 of the exact same high school courses, and my teachers should have seen that immediately, but they just laughed at me because I'm like, hey. So I had one biology teacher. I love biology, was exceptional at it, but I had one biology teacher that spoke the whole classroom, just talked, made almost no notes on the board. And another biology teacher who did nothing but write on the board, did almost no talking. Do you know that I did wonderfully in the biology class that the teacher spoke? But the one where he wrote on the board constantly, I flunked horribly. Imagine. Already, I just can't even go into it. Like, trust me, I knew the material. But would a teacher give a rat's? No. They just made it seem like, oh, well, there's different learning styles. No, that's a sign of a learning barrier. And as I said, I think what I've figured out is the secret to all of this is unlocking ebooks and audiobooks for our kids, our textbooks. But look at our market, right? If you like a book, believe it or not, you have to buy it 3 times. Physical, audio, and ebook. Right? So schools will be like, oh, that's just costing us too much money. What does it cost us having 20 to 80% of our population not achieving their full potential? What are we missing out? How many great advancements? How many great minds?